My name is Casey Hersch. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, author, and founder of LightYourSparkle.life. Today, I'm very excited to be spending some time with Dr. David Perlmutter. He is a board-certified neurologist and five-time New York Times bestselling author. Many of you recognize his name as a result of the profound health movement that started with his book, Grain Brain. He has a lot of books out there. Some other New York Times bestsellers include Brain Maker, the Grain Brain Cookbook, and coming up here in February of 2022, he has a new book coming out called Drop Acid, which focuses on the pivotal role of uric acid in metabolic diseases. And we're going to be talking a little bit about why this is so important in the interview. So let's get started. Dr. Perlmutter, thanks for taking the time to meet with me.
I am delighted to be with you today, Casey.
Great. I want to spend a moment and just tell you why I'm here. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a patient who lives with Crohn's disease. And I've spent the past 20 years devoting my life to studying and exploring integrative methods for healing. Initially, I was driven to save my own life and reverse conventional medicine's prophecy that I would die or lose my organs. But eventually my purpose became larger when I realized that I could use my adversity to help others. When I was critically ill, I relied on clinicians and healers to guide me. And looking back, they fortunately referred to your work time and time again. And without even knowing it, your philosophies became part of my healing journey. And now I am an empowered patient. So let's get started and help others find their healing power. You stress in your book, Grain Brain, that America is myopically focused on symptom management while preventing disease is not prioritized. You urge people to pay attention to important body connections if they want to reclaim or sustain their health. One of these connections is the significant role our gut has in disease treatment and prevention. Can you summarize why focusing on the gut is so important?
Well, it's going to be tough to summarize, but let me see if I can take a crack at that. There's so much amazing and wonderful information, not the least of which is that we began our time together as a neurologist and a person suffered from a gut-related illness, and how you found that the information that we were provided that related to the brain seemed to be helpful for you. So this whole notion of this gut-brain relationship, I think is highly valid and validated these days. But, you know, there was a time in the not too distant past when the brain was considered to be quite separate from other body parts. And indeed, all body parts were thought to sort of exist in and of themselves. Hence the idea of medical specialists, you know, a doctor that dealt with the GI system and another doctor that might deal with the heart or the brain. And such lack of communication to the detriment ultimately of the whole patient, the integrated functionality that defines your body. So as it relates to the brain and its relationship to the gut, and we could, you know, truthfully have this discussion with respect to any part of the body, but the brain is a very sensitive organ. It's sensitive to having enough energy. It's sensitive to certain processes in the body, for example, inflammation. And as fate would have it, these processes, just those two and so many more, are intimately dependent upon the functionality of the gut, and more specifically, on the input to that functionality that is provided by the bacteria that live within the gut. These bacteria, including their metabolites as well as their genetic material, are collectively known as the microbiome. That term, you know, is sort of taken to mean, well, just the gut bacteria, but it really means more than that. But that said, as we get back to these processes of the energetics of the brain, how the brain utilizes its fuel to do all the magnificent things that it does, the way that our metabolism is able to function is influenced significantly by what the output is of our gut bacteria. Their metabolites influence our insulin functionality, how our blood sugar is regulated, and even their metabolites influence our DNA expression. That's pretty heavy, that these bugs flying around in our gut are changing our life code moment to moment in terms of its expression. They're not changing the keys on the piano, but they're just changing how the song is played. And I think that's really empowering. It's breathtaking, but it's empowering in the area of then how we can leverage that information to bring about a good situation for the brain, for the heart, for the rest of the body, for the density of our bones, for our ability to deal with a viral insult, for example. So we are just beginning to understand how influential our gut microbiome is. And now that we're understanding it, it really causes us to take a step back and ask the fundamental question. Therefore, if it's so darn important, what can we do to nurture its health and functionality?
Yeah. Wow, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's so much new information out there, but then again, a lot of this has been, I think, present for a long time, especially for those of us who live with inflammatory bowel disease and these, gut disorders. We've known for a long time, just intuitively, that our brain is connected, because you could tell, like, when there's stress, sometimes the gut microbes feel like they're a little bit more active. So I
Well,
think
I
when you
mean,
live with it, you know that.
this goes back to Hippocrates. This is not news. But even early on in my career, let's say 25 years ago, we were beginning to certainly see that there were neurological accompaniments to inflammatory bowel disease, not just cognitive issues and mood issues, but actually brain changes, white matter areas in the brain that looked like multiple sclerosis, for that matter, that were seen to be more highly likely in individuals with inflammatory bowel disease. So, it's a big system, and it's all related. And the same factors that are involved in inflammation in one part of the body go on to affect other parts of the body. It's not like inflammatory bowel disease is just a bowel situation. The entire immune system is challenged. Inflammation is upregulated throughout the body. And, these days when we are looking, for example, at how people respond to a viral challenge like SARS-CoV-2, we see differences based upon whether or not they have an inflammatory bowel condition, an autoimmune condition, or even more importantly, if they're being treated for these conditions, it sure affects how they respond or did respond to this virus. So that demonstrates, again, connection of the gut to the entire body. And it shouldn't surprise us, because that's where our nutrition comes from. That's where our short chain fatty acids come from that influence metabolism and influence gene expression. As it relates to the brain, it's where we manufacture most of our neurotransmitters. These are the chemicals that underlie how the brain cells communicate with each other, things like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, et cetera. So it shouldn't be a surprise. And the good news is, in the context of being able to take this information and do good things with it, it's really opened a very, very wide door.
Yeah. You mentioned, Dr. Perlmutter, inflammation, and you talk about how it's a process of body degeneration or a biological type of resting. Can you elaborate for those of us who may hear the word inflammation but not quite understand what it means?
Sure. Well, inflammation is a normal process, a good thing in your body. It's the context. Inflammation is how we wall off an infection. It's how we instigate wound healing. It's how we recruit cells that are needed to a particular area to heal a wound or to deal with an insect bite or whatever it may be. So it's an integral part of our physiology that helps us survive. The problem is that when it becomes suddenly hugely amplified, these chemical mediators of inflammation called cytokines can be very, very destructive. In the context, again, of COVID, we call that the cytokine storm.
Mhm.
But I think it's valuable to also consider the cytokine drizzle. And what does that mean? It means not a huge amount of inflammation, but just the presence of smoldering fire for a long period of time is also quite threatening to our health, certainly threatening to the brain and the heart and the lining of the arteries and multiple areas of the body, threatens the way that we're able to respond to certain chemicals like insulin, hormones like insulin. So again, it's something that it's like the Goldilocks zone. Not enough is a bad thing. There's a sweet spot, and then too much is once again a bad thing. And I think it's really valuable then to ask ourselves, what are the things that fan the flames? And literally, the word comes from inflame, doesn't
Mhm.
it? Inflammation. What are the things that fan the flames of inflammation? And these days, as we see higher and higher markers of inflammation around the world, correlating with higher rates of overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, cancer, and even Alzheimer's, we recognize that something has changed. And I think the biggest issue that seems to have changed, that is augmenting inflammation around the world and leading to higher rates of these chronic degenerative conditions that the World Health Organization makes very clear are the number one cause of death on planet Earth. And diet is really, I think, at the top of the list. The diet now was called the Western diet, but it's now becoming the global diet, is a diet that's higher in ultra processed foods, that has a lot of added sweetener like fructose, sugar, and it's really a powerfully pro-inflammatory diet that in and of itself increases inflammation and secondarily increases inflammation because of how darn traumatic it is to our gut bacteria, leading to changes in the ratios of various bacteria and even threatening the metabolites that our gut bacteria create. We need those metabolites and the action of good bacteria to keep the gut lining intact so that we don't develop something like leaky gut that fans the flames of inflammation. We don't want inflammation in the gut, because then we develop things like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, inflammatory disease of the bowel.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and 20 years ago, I remember distinctly when I was first diagnosed, reading about different alternatives for diet and even taking fish oil supplements. This was when I was just really green in this world. And, my physician told me I could do anything I wanted. I could drink beer and eat cheesy pizza and it would make no difference. But I learned really early on from such, paramount influences, fortunately, that it does matter. And so diet, has been really clean in my life. And I know it's just a crucial, crucial piece of why I'm still here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the reality of the situation is very few medical schools in America today teach nutrition.
Mhm.
Uh, I've been saying that since I was in medical school. It happened before I was in medical school, but um, if you go to vet school, you learn about nutrition for animals because it's important, right? And
Yeah.
if you're growing plants, you know what nutrients they need to grow. But yet, as it relates to us and our health, no one seems to, at least in mainstream medicine, really be paying that much attention to it. And it's fundamentally important, certainly as it relates to treating people, but I think more importantly, in terms of keeping people healthy in the first place. And that's another area that's really neglected in modern medicine, and that is the notion of proactive actions as opposed to reactive. In other words, keeping people healthy as opposed to reacting to a patient who comes in with inflammatory bowel disease. What drug will we use? No, we want to keep people healthy. We want to keep their insulin functioning, their blood sugars low, inflammation low, and really allow them to be in a situation where they're at less risk for getting these diseases for which we think, well, I'll just live my life, get that disease, and take a pill, and everything's going to be great. That's not reality.
Yeah. Dr. Perlmutter, surveys show that one of the greatest worries people have as they age is what's going to happen if they get Alzheimer's or dementia and lose the ability to remember and recall. However, you empower us with knowledge that the root of many of these brain related disorders are actually not in the brain, but are also in the gut. So, how is our gut health connected to our brain health?
Well, really gets back to, and there are many, many connections, but I think two of the biggest mechanisms that are related to the gut and the brain would be first inflammation. Inflammation, to a significant degree, has its genesis in the disruption of the gut bacteria, their metabolites, especially. And the other thing that the gut really is involved in is keeping our blood sugar, keeping our metabolism where it needs to be. And when we disrupt our gut bacteria with things like antibiotics and other insults, various medications, for example, the acid blocking proton pump inhibitor drugs that are available over the counter, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, these are disruptive to the gut bacteria, and research demonstrates, one study that was published in the journal Stroke clearly shows a strong relationship between the use of these proton pump acid blocking drugs and risk for developing stroke or even full-blown Alzheimer's disease. So there's a lot that we can talk about then. We know that our gut bacteria are involved in manufacturing certain vitamins in the B vitamin group. B vitamins are really important for the brain. B vitamins help to keep a chemical called homocysteine in check. Higher levels of homocysteine threaten the brain and are clearly associated with a dramatic increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So, sound mind through a sound gut. I mean, you're having a discussion today with a brain specialist, a neurologist, and so far we're talking about the gut and all the inputs, bad and good. Bad being some of the things we have to be careful of, and good, the addition of good levels of prebiotic fiber to our diet so that we can increase the amount of the functionality of our good bacteria. Our diet such that we don't do other things that can threaten our gut bacteria, like drink chlorinated water, for example. There's so many things that we can do. Even the quality and quantity of our sleep, whether we exercise or not, do we get out in nature? All of these things they funnel into the health and more importantly, the functionality of the microbiome. And this has a big role to play in terms of brain health.
Yeah, so people might be wondering as they're listening to this that, oh, how am I going to find out if I have any risk factors? Are there any tests in any ways I can check inflammation, gut permeability? Do you have any suggestions on some tests that people might be able to request from their physician?
Well, even before you get to your physician, if, as you noted, I've written many books on this topic, and I think probably a brain maker would be a good place to start, so that you take the quiz and it lets you know, based upon your score, if you are threatening your gut. It talks about the medications you may be taking, what your diet is like, et cetera. And that's a great place to start. Then when you get to your doctor, I think some really good metrics as to the health of your gut would be to use a very powerful tool called a tape measure. Wrap that puppy around your waist. That'll give you a sense as to health of your gut bacteria. A big belly translates into disruption of your gut bacteria, as does an elevation of your blood sugar, as does elevation of markers of inflammation, like C-reactive protein, which is something commonly now tested in the doctor's office. But I think as we see the development of metabolic issues, specifically things like prediabetes and full-blown diabetes, that's a powerful, straightforward indication that gut bacteria have been disrupted, and therapy needs to be directed to bring that area of your body back to good health.
Yeah. So many of us are still locked into some false beliefs about fats and good fat, bad fat, cholesterol, good carbs, bad carbs, grains, sugar. Can you highlight some of the most common misconceptions that may keep people caught in a cycle of illness?
Sure. And I'd say first, be a conscious consumer, and don't be prey for marketing and media. I mean, we've been told for the past 30 years that dietary fat will make, is the enemy, will make terrible things happen. Our children are going to be born naked. I don't know, all kinds of terrible things happen. And, humans have been eating high levels of calorie dense fat as a survival mechanism for as long as we've walked this planet. Dietary fat, good high quality dietary fat, begets a healthy microbiome. It speaks to our genome and allows the expression of genes that code for health. And what happened, the past 3 decades is we've been bombarded with a message that fat is somehow the enemy. And that what that did was it opened the door for more sugar and carbohydrate consumption. And that's a change to the human diet, the likes of which we have never seen. The amount of sugar consumption by humans in the past 100 years has gone up from around maybe 5 pounds a year up to over 100 pounds a year per person. And that is threatening the health of the gut bacteria. It directly challenges our blood glucose and ultimately is, I think, playing a very important role in so many of our chronic degenerative conditions that I mentioned earlier. And now we're even gaining some more refined and exciting information that indicates that this specific sugar called fructose
Mhm.
that's being added to so many of our foods in the form of high fructose corn syrup is particularly threatening to human health. Fructose is metabolized in the human body to become something called uric acid. And this is really new and exciting science. I mean, we've known about uric acid. Many of people who are going to listen or watch our time together today will say, yeah, my doctor checks it every year. The question is why? Well, the reason they check it is because high levels of uric acid are associated with gout and kidney stones.
Mm.
End of story. And if your uric acid is elevated and you don't have gout or kidney stones, they say, well, that's asymptomatic hyperuricemia. It means your uric acid level is high, but it doesn't mean anything because you don't have gout or kidney stones. Well, that's really out of touch with modern research that links uric acid as a powerful messenger molecule telling your body to make fat, store fat, increase production of glucose, raise your blood pressure, change your lipids, your cholesterol values, and do these things as a survival mechanism. And that allowed our ancestors to make body fat so that they'd be ready for times of caloric scarcity when there wouldn't be any food around. So this is a powerful mechanism that has been present in primates for about 15 million years, allowing those to survive who could make more body fat when they consumed fruit sugar in the form of berries or whatever they would stumble upon, made it through the winter because they had higher levels of storage. Well, that's not what we need anymore. We've got plenty of calories. Winter isn't coming. We're not going to have a time when we can't get food. And so we're using this body mechanism, this that we've inherited, that causes us to make body fat, become insulin resistant, raises our blood pressure, increases inflammation when we consume fructose. So I think it's a powerful message that people now need to pay attention to uric acid in a whole new context, in a context that this is a messenger that's telling the body to basically prepare for winter. And it's a winter that never comes.
Well, one of the topics that continues to cause me some confusion has to do with grain-free diets. So I'm a competitive ballroom dancer and I rely a lot on carbs, organic brown rice, organic white rice. Now, I don't consume refined sugars or junk food, but I also don't think about the quantities of carbs and sugar that I consume. And that's largely because my A1C and all of my numbers have been, really low. I thought it's because I get so much exercise. Now, how does exercise play into the grain and carb equation, and does it mitigate some of the negative effects?
I would say that I'm all in as it relates to eating grains, and that's from the author of Grain Brain. But I would say that you touched upon the issue of quantity, first of all. And I think you have to be judicious. Having a serving of whole grain white rice, whole grain rice, I think is great. I think there's great fiber there. There's some carbs, that's for sure. But it's the high refinement of grains that becomes an issue, whether it's rice or corn. These are, seeds of grass, and their consumption can be threatening depending on how they're treated. We also know that some grains, certainly not all, wheat, barley, and rye, contain something called gluten. And I think it's pretty clear that the research is indicating that in many people, gluten is a threat, especially as it relates to inflammation and as it relates to gut permeability. Not all people, but by and large, it's a good idea to limit your gluten consumption. If you have celiac disease, you should have zero gluten in your diet. And if you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, you really want to do your best to cut it out of your diet. But again, context is important as it gets back to your statement related to serving size. If you feel better having a portion of whole grain rice before you do your competitive dancing or whatever activity you do, then I'd say have at it. But you mentioned that your A1C remains normal, and it's an interesting metric. It's not a great metric. It's an average, as you know. It's an average marker of your blood sugar over a 90-day period. What would be more beneficial is to know moment to moment, what is your blood sugar, and how is that blood sugar affected by eating some rice, some perhaps white rice versus whole grain, wild rice, and maybe having something processed and seeing how that affects your blood sugar within the next 15 minutes or hour. Maybe you are affected like I am by cashews. Who knew? I wouldn't know unless I wore a continuous glucose monitor, which I wear. And it tells me the effects of any particular food or activity or other lifestyle choice, like what time I go to bed. Do I get out in nature? How much stress am I dealing with? Do I meditate? All these things can be looked at through the lens of moment-to-moment glucose measurement, which is something available now to anyone. So, when you ask that question, there's a great answer, and that is find out.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And like you say, or what you're definitely saying is that everybody's different. So we have to pay attention to how our body is responding to these things and get to know our body as best that we can.
That's right. And this goes by various names. I like the term precision medicine or personalized, because it rather than saying that, you go into a doctor's office, say, my feet hurt. And the doctor says, well, maybe you ought to wear a pair of shoes when you walk 5 miles. And you say, gee, that's a great idea. And you get a prescription for a pair of shoes. That's the medicine. You go and they give you a pair of shoes, but they're a size 9 and you wear a size 11. They don't fit. Well, that's what you can go back to the doctor and he or she's going to say, well, that's what works for most people. Sorry, it's going to have to work for you. And that's the approach of medicine today. It's looking at large populations, determining what is the best blood glucose measurement for large populations. Where should we keep people's blood pressure, ideally for them? How much fat, carbohydrates, and protein should people in general consume? And, getting back to our earlier discussion on continuous glucose monitoring, we have technology today that is able to tell us what works best for an individual. How much should they be consuming of a particular food, or does their genetics indicate that they might need higher levels of vitamin D? Whatever it may be, we have the ability to deconstruct an individual based on his or her specific markers and determining what maybe it isn't best, but at least we'll say better. What's going to be better for that person in comparison to the very next person, because everyone's different. So, I think it's important to realize that it's more important to know the individual who has the disease rather than just the disease a person has. If a person has high blood pressure, well, is it because of their diet in terms of its salt? Is it because of their genetics? Is it because of any number of factors? I think we got to look at those factors prior to saying, oh, here's the drug I'm really comfortable with and using to treat blood pressure. Hope it works. Hope that size 9 shoe is going to fit you, even though you're a size 11.
Yeah. Dr. Perlmutter, you touch on something in your books called nighttime hypoglycemia. Can you talk a little bit about hypoglycemia? Because we hear a lot about diabetes and high blood sugar. What's happening in the hypoglycemia sense?
So hypo means low, glycemia means sugar, and in relation to hyperglycemia, where people get high blood sugar, hypoglycemia is a pretty rare. But what happens is some people just have a bit of an abnormal response, insulin-related response, and actually this can follow a period of a moment of high blood sugar where they challenge their bodies with something that elevates their blood sugar. Their insulin response is a little bit over the top, and then their blood sugar is driven to pretty low levels. And it's not necessarily just the low level to where their blood sugar arrives, but it's also the rate of change, how quickly that blood sugar is dropping, that can cause symptoms of, fatigue, confusion, even shortness of breath, lightheadedness, and some people even get sweaty
Mhm.
and really don't feel well. So, this is when we do specific testing in the old days, whereby people would drink a very sweetened beverage that we call glucola, and then they would have hourly measurements of their blood sugar and hopefully their serum insulin levels as well, and we would determine how they responded to the sugar load, monitoring things. I always like to add potassium to that measurement because some people drop their potassiums during this event as well. And we would diagnose these people. Well, now in the day of being able to monitor your own blood sugar, you can see directly how quickly it drops. I mean, when you have a continuous glucose monitor on, it will graph the level of blood sugar throughout a 24-hour period. And you can watch that happen if you're one of those individuals who has a sudden fall of your blood sugar.
Yeah, that's really exciting to me because like you say, it could be, we often assume, oh, it's low, I feel it, I need more sugar, but it could be in response to having a surge of a lot of sugar and then now you're dropping. So knowing that, like you said,
Exactly right.
find
And you
out.
go, that's right. And you go from high sugar meal to high sugar meal because that's the fix. The trick is to stabilize your blood sugar, and even more importantly, to train your body to utilize alternative sources of fuel like ketones. So we don't get blood sugar bouncing when we're on a ketogenic diet, and we have ketones in our bodies. So that's the value of really restricting refined carbohydrates, and even fasting, for example, caloric restriction, is we can start to build up ketones, and a derivative of fat metabolism to utilize as a fuel for the body.
Yeah. Dr. Perlmutter, as a psychotherapist, I know how much childhood trauma can negatively program the brain and the nervous system and the gut. So in my case, I had a lot of trauma in my childhood in addition to loads of antibiotics. And I do believe that that laid a really strong foundation for Crohn's disease. Now, a lot of research says that if you've had that early programming, you might keep that programming with you for the duration of your life. Now, on the other hand, we know that there's neuroplasticity. So based on your background, do you believe it's possible to fully reset the microbiome and the brain, or do some of those elements just remain with you forever?
Well, I think these are two very distinct questions. Let's first deal with the microbiome. Can you rehab your microbiome having experienced trauma to it, like antibiotics, et cetera? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, the extreme case of that is undergoing what's called fecal microbial transplant, whereby the gut is sterilized and then it is repopulated with the bacteria from another person. So that's what this fecal microbial transplant is all about. Certainly a powerful therapy for something called C. diff, enteritis, Clostridium difficile, but now being used in other contexts like obesity and like even type 2 diabetes. So we're just beginning to understand what that's all about and its therapeutic potential. Now, the other question that is, I think, let's say somewhat distinct, and that would be, can you reframe or recontextualize the influences of your childhood experiences in terms of how you are dealing with and responding to day-to-day experiences that are happening now in your life? And I think to some degree that is possible to do. But understand that these are deep mechanisms that allow us to encode a framework from which we will then see the world and make our choices and choose our behaviors based upon what we experience in childhood. It's a powerful preserved mechanism that allows us to gain those important tools that will then last us a lifetime for appropriately responding to the environment. The problem is that some of these early life experiences are profoundly negative, and they continue to color our response to our day-to-day experiences now when it's inappropriate, when we might respond to a situation or a challenge based upon a childhood engram, which is unrelated. And to some degree, that can be remedied. Step one has to be, however, that we become aware of that childhood engram and recognize the context in which it happened and understand it for what it is. It can then be, to some degree, reworked when we feel that that engram has again been activated by an experience that we may have today. I do believe that the use of psychedelics may well allow that whole process to have more, to be more functional, more efficacy. That area, exploring the impact and the imprinting of childhood experiences, and through the use of psychedelics, is just beginning. But, you know, Freud had it right when he talked about how our childhood influences us as adults, but we have the ability to some degree, as you mentioned, through neuroplasticity, to reroute how some of those influences affect us today.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, great news. And also I'm excited that you mentioned psychedelics, because I think it's just emerging right now at a great speed in the mental health profession and in medicine. So I'm really excited to see where it's going to take us. You mentioned the fecal microbial transplant. So I love that you talk about this in your book, because for someone with inflammatory bowel disease, I've followed the research, of course, numerous times. I'm told, oh, it only is FDA approved for people with C. diff. It's, there's just a lot of information, I think, as a patient that is
Let me
negative.
just hold you right there. It
Yeah.
is, as yet, despite its incredible effectiveness in C. diff, it is not yet FDA approved for routine use in Clostridium difficile.
Oh.
It is about 85 to 90%, and some reports even 95% effective in eradicating that situation, in comparison to what is FDA approved, and that is the use of antibiotics, which may be 20 to 25% effective. So here is an incredibly effective treatment being used experimentally around the country in more than 80 hospitals that doesn't have FDA approval, and yet it's safer than antibiotics and far more effective.
So if a patient, has inflammatory bowel disease and they're facing a bowel resection, there's nothing to lose by trying these unconventional approaches, and possibly everything to gain, but then there's barriers to access. So what can someone do?
Nothing to lose. I wouldn't say that any of these interventions is necessarily 100% without risk. The risk of FMT, there was one case that was reported in the journal The Lancet, where a woman with C. diff was given fecal material from her daughter, because obviously, it would really match up. And thereafter, and got rid of her C. diff, but then she gained a lot of weight. Her daughter was fat. And they made such a big deal about it, that, we have to be so careful in screening the donors. Yeah, you do need to be careful in screening the donors for transmissible issues, et cetera. That's very important, and it's standard practice. But because she gained weight having received her daughter's fecal material, that was looked upon as being, the huge contraindication to its use. We can easily look up the downsides of the standard of care medicine, which is vancomycin, one of the antibiotics used to treat C. diff. And, you'd probably find a couple of pages in the PDR that talk about potential downsides of using an antibiotic, and how odd it would be that the reason people generally develop C. diff, one important reason, is because of antibiotic exposure. And yet the treatment that's allowed by the FDA is what? More antibiotic usage. It's an interesting observation, isn't it?
It's definitely interesting. Yeah. And I think it's really challenging for patients who are trying to, navigate all of that. It's quite maddening. So I'm hopeful that things will become more readily available. And I agree with you, though, of course, nothing is completely foolproof, and there needs to be some screening mechanisms in place with definitely donors, and how you're getting whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's a test or a product or a supplement or whatever, you have to be careful.
Above all, do no harm.
Do no harm. Yes. You talk about how we face daily through our dietary choices alone potentially deadly toxins that trigger our immune systems. In your opinion, what is the most dangerous toxin that we have in our lives today?
I think perhaps it's in the context of how we respond. So humans have always faced toxins through ingestion of one thing or another, in the plant world, as an example. But fortunately, we have the ability through the wonder, the gift of our gut microbiome to deal with toxic influences, and even of course in the liver. But so we're set up to deal with toxins, provided we have a healthy microbiome, we have good liver functionality, et cetera. It's hard to say these days what the biggest threat from a toxic perspective would be to human health. I probably, if you made me, I put my nickel down on fructose.
Oh,
And I
okay.
think this is what's spreading to become the global diet. And I think what we now know about fructose, directly and through its increasing of uric acid, is a huge threat, through the increased development of these metabolic degenerative conditions that are ranked as the #1 cause of death on planet Earth. And it's through the changes in our diet. I mean, I think there are other forms of toxicity to which we are exposed, including the social, societal nature of our interactions with other communities and other countries. Within countries, we're seeing toxicity in terms of how people are relating to each other. That's threatening, and it has biophysiological consequences, measurable changes in markers in response to the threats that people are enduring, with threats from people who don't happen to share their ideology. So there are toxic insults to our health and physiology coming from multiple sources.
Yeah. So you've definitely shared a lot about why our gut bugs are so important. So can you share some ways that people can maximize the healing potential of those gut bugs?
Sure. I think first and foremost, we would want to catalog how are we threatening our gut bacteria? And that would mean looking at the quality of our food through the lens of, are our gut bugs going to like this or not? Just because we happen to like, to eat popsicles, does that mean our gut bugs are going to like that? So looking at the quality of our food, are we threatening our gut bacteria with our food choices? Are we threatening our gut bacteria with other insults like medications we may be taking? The quality of the water that we consume. Are our gut bacteria being threatened by our environment? We know that glyphosate, which is the world's most popular herbicide used aggressively around the world to kill weeds in agriculture and also around the home, according to Dr. Stephanie Seneff at MIT, is a powerful insult to the health and functionality of our gut bacteria. So we need to look at the threats, remove them. That's the first R. Replete them with respect to using good probiotics, and restore their functionality, the third R, by giving them what they need. And our gut bacteria need good levels of what is called prebiotic fiber. And we get that from eating plants, basically. We don't get it from eating animal products. There's no prebiotic fiber or fiber of any sort in animal products. And I am not a strict vegetarian. I will say that I do eat some animal products, but it's important that we get a lot of fiber. I mean, the amount of fiber the average American consumes right now is somewhere around 15 to maybe 20 grams on a good day. We need well over 100 grams of good dietary fiber every day to nurture our gut bacteria, because our life depends upon it. Our ability to remain healthy, to stave off illness, is really contingent upon a wide array of gut bacteria, and more importantly, their functionality, the ability that they have to do all the wonderful things that they are doing day in and day out to keep us going.
Absolutely. And I love just going full circle back to the beginning, the book that started all of this profound health movement being Grain Brain. You talk about how the ideas just spread through good old fashioned word of mouth, and people who had positive results, they propelled the movement. So There's
I
so
will tell
much.
you that I write my books based upon those results, including a lot of what people tell me.
Mhm.
But I think at the end of the day, or maybe even at the beginning of the day, it's all about what good science is telling us. I mean, my books, I have 3, 4, 500 references, close to 500 references in Grain Brain. And, my new book, which is called Drop Acid, which has to do with lowering uric acid, not anything else, is, again, we have close to 500 references there that show that this uric acid that we talked about earlier, we used to think it was not so important, is really a key player in why we get fat, in why our blood sugars go up, and why our blood pressure goes up, and why we have changes in our body lipids, our cholesterol, good and bad cholesterol. So the science is what motivates these books, and what are really good, dedicated researchers telling us. Let's pay attention.
Yeah. And thank you for giving us that hope. And within your books, it's nice too, because you have all the research, but then you have other books that kind of summarize everything and make it like more compact. So here you go. This is how you implement, mentioning things like probiotic enemas and fermented foods and probiotics and all these other, great nutritious options and recipes that are really doable.
A watchword for me has in writing and in podcasting has always been focus on what's user friendly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all well and good to discuss, something that's being developed that we may have 10 years from now, on and on. I love that stuff. But, I think people want to know, okay, I get the message. I want to lose weight. I want to rein in my blood pressure. I want my diabetes to go away, or at least get under better control. What can I do today? And it turns out that the response to those questions is often very straightforward. While, again, the notion of personalized or precision medicine is really valuable, we do know the broad strokes. We do know the effect of fructose. We do know what lack of exercise does. We do know what uric acid elevation does. And so these are broad strokes that, people can leverage now and gain a foothold, so that they're not dependent upon the prescription that they were given day in and day out to manage these downstream effects of eating inappropriately, of lack of exercise, of not getting enough sleep.
Yeah. And it really is integration. It's physical, it's emotional, it's lifestyle, it's the things that bring you joy. There's so many facets that, that people have to incorporate to achieve wellness. And, you bring up all of those, and you did today, spending time
Well,
in
thank you. Thank
nature.
you so much for having me. Drop Acid book comes out in February of
Oh,
22. So this February.
exciting. Thank you, Dr. Perlmutter. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.